I still remember the exact way the light fell that evening. Soft, honeyed, the kind of light Lagos gives you when the heat finally gives up for the day and the Atlantic breathes a cool, salty whisper across the city. I remember because that light settled on my mother's face and gave her, for the first time in a long while, something like peace. I remember because a month later she would stand in another light entirely, a clinical, cobalt glow of European street lamps, and tell me, with startling clarity, that she had decided to stay. I am Mark. This is my story. It is the story of a family stitched together and torn apart by choices, traditions, and the uneven ways we all try to belong. It is a story about polygamy in a modern world, about what it means to be a son, and what it means to be a woman claiming her life after a lifetime of compromises. And it is fundamentally a story about agency, who gets it, who loses it, and what happens when an older woman, my mother, decides to take it back. My father and my mother were never what people in our neighborhood called properly married. My father, a proud man with a tight jaw and the discipline of someone who had fought for every inch of his life, refused to file the papers, refused to sign the marriage registry that would have made my mother his wife in the eyes of the state. That's business, he used to say, with a shrug that tried to make it trivial. Religion is heart, paper is paper. In practice, his refusal allowed space for other attachments to move in. He added wives to our home, the way some men add new books to a shelf. Because there was room, because he could, and because the unwritten rules of his family lineage allowed him. I was a child, then tall for my age, and always watching the way adults arrange themselves like pieces on a board, and I learned early that family could be elastic. My mother bore the elasticity like a bruise. She smiled, cooked, sewed, and made our house warm, but there was a distance in her eyes like a weathered map. The first time my mother told me she regretted, I was 13. We were in the living room. Outside, motorbikes whined past, and someone played an old High Life record on a battered radio. I had asked her why she had never learned to drive. The question made her laugh, and then she was quiet. Because I learned other things, she said. I learned to keep a home and to keep peace. I kept my children. I kept the face. I did not learn to say no. She had arrived in our lives young, with hands that could mend any cloth and a voice that softened the rooms. She had loved in the slow, brick-by-brick way that many women in our neighborhood learned to love, pragmatic, tending to the necessities of survival, shaping affection into meals and quiet support. My father loved her in his own way, often in short bursts of generosity, in stern lectures about the world. But the parts of him that refused to sign and refused to commit fully were not merely bureaucratic conveniences. They were a pattern, a structure that allowed him to keep options open, and over the years he used them. 2 more women came into our compound. New kitchens, new opinions, new loyalties. Sometimes there was laughter. Sometimes there was misaligned jealousy, like a bruise. For me, growing into a man in that home, it was confusing. I loved my father because he had taught me how to take apart a generator and put it back together, how to stand in a room and make your voice count. I loved my mother because she was a place that felt like being saved, and yet both of them were, in different ways, unavailable. That is the shape of many Nigerian families, layered, messy, full of warmth and sharp edges. But ours had a particular ache because the absence of legal commitment meant my mother never had the safety net that formal marriage sometimes provides. Years passed. I left for university, then for work. I married, like many do, in a ceremony that tried to balance love and pragmatism. The pastor's blessing, the bride's whispers to cameras. My wife and I made our lives in Europe. The city we chose gave us a different kind of rhythm. Streets were clean and quiet, shops closed on time, and services happened with bureaucratic efficiency that felt, at first, almost ritualistic. Our son was born on a rainy Monday in February, body small and loud, his first cries splintering the sterile air of the delivery room. It was during that fragile, awestruck week of new parenthood that my mother was invited to come. She came carrying a bundle of dried egusi and a scent of home in the fabric of her bag. I picked her up from the arrivals hall, and the hug she gave me was the kind that held years and made them soft. She stayed with us for 3 months, moving through our small apartment as if she were rehearsing herself for something, boiling yam in a pot that fit poorly on our stove, teaching my wife how to fold garments in that patient manner she used to adopt when she wanted to make everything right. For a while, the house contained only good things. My son learned his grandmother's hands, and my wife learned my mother's way of making pepper soup that tasted like Sunday afternoons before she left. Then, one morning, a message came. It was 8 lines and no punctuation. "I'm back in Europe," she had written. "I'll be staying for a while." A day later, my father called. I could hear the humidity in his voice, a heat that had no weather. "Bring her back," he said. "You are my son. Bring her back." That call cracked something loose inside me. It wasn't only the imperative tone. It was the assumption that because I lived abroad, because I had acquired a passport and a house that sometimes smelled of infant powder, I was the instrument of his will. I felt my chest shrink with the weight of an old obligation that hadn't been mine to bear. "Why?" I asked him. "Why should I bring her back?" "Because she should not stay there without permission," he snapped. "She belongs in our home. You know how this will look. You know these people. We do not need scandal." The word scandal in his mouth felt like a verdict. It was as though the world might not survive the idea of a woman, older and alone, choosing a different path, choosing, perhaps, to be happy. I turned to my mother for answers and found a stranger in the kitchen. She had the same hands, thick, scarred from years of kitchen knives, but there was a new absence in them, something like a gap where she had kept small private dreams. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Mark," she said, "I'm engaged." The syllables came out clean as a stone falling. In the tiny apartment, everything went quiet in a way that felt like the pause between heartbeats. My first reaction was practical. Who? How? When? The second reaction, the older, more jagged one, was a memory of all those years of being patient, the long inhale of a woman who had swallowed shame and kept smiling. She told me the story slowly, like someone describing a dream that had become real. She had been walking that evening, the kind of walk she told me later she took to help sleep come easier. And at the park she met a man. He was white, he was older, and his name was Thomas. He had been sitting on a bench with a thermos of coffee, his hair more salt than black. In the way of strangers who are used to being strangers, they had started to talk. He asked me the time, she said. Then he asked where I was from. Then he asked why I was walking alone. He listened. I told him about you. He told me that I was brave. He asked if he could see me again. That night, while the city outside hummed with indifferent traffic, I felt a complicated surge of feelings. There was, somewhere beneath them, the childish image of my mother as a figure who could not be touched by the same kind of romantic possibility afforded to younger women. There was also something else. The uncomfortable knowledge that my father, who had always kept options as if by right, could bristle at another man's attention to the woman he had kept without paper. The conversation ended with threats and with my father's expectation that I would, in short, restore order. What followed was a courtroom of the heart, a tribunal made of phone calls and midnight conversations with my wife, who watched me with an expression that was equal parts worry and tenderness. She understood, perhaps more than I did in that moment, the precarious balancing act between respect to my mother's autonomy and keeping peace with a patriarch who still held fast to an older kind of power. Her counsel was practical. "Let her make her own choices," she told me. "This is not about you. It's about her." I carried that sentence like a talisman into our next confrontation, when my mother returned to Europe. Indeed, when she announced she had come back to stay, I could have forced the issue. I could have been the dutiful son and written my father's wishes into action. I could have called the embassy and arranged flights. I could have convinced her that a comfortable home in Nigeria was better than the foreign lights she had met. But there is a difference between rescuing someone and policing their life. Instead, I asked again, why him? "It wasn't about him at first," she said. "It was about being heard. He listened without measuring me like I was a problem. He asked me questions I had never been invited to answer." She told me about their walks, the way Thomas shaped sentences to make her laugh, the small mercies, an arm at her back on slippery pavements, an umbrella during sudden rain. He had been patient, consistent, and free of the old expectations that had bound her shoulders. No demands for dowry, no old wives to appease, no anonymous custom stitched into his speech. There was an innocence to their hesitance, and also a deep seriousness. Two people in the later chapters of their lives testing the possibility of companionship. There is in the telling a lesson I would learn and relearn. Intimacy takes many forms. It is not always loud and torrential. Sometimes it is a man who asks what your favorite spice is and remembers it. For my mother, after decades of being a secondary actor in a play she had not directed, the attention felt revolutionary. The world, however, is brittle when it comes to shaking up expectations. My father's reaction was immediate. Disrespect, betrayal, and the old fear of shame. That fear, in many families I have known, was not purely about reputation. It was about power. If my mother could make a choice without consulting him, what else might slip? His anger felt less like the outrage of a wronged husband and more like the anxiety of someone who had built authority on an unspoken hierarchy. Family members lined up on particular sides and spoke in tones of caution. This is not how we do things. Cousins whispered about the need for proper arrangements. Some of my siblings took the state's view. If she wants to stay, that's her right. Others drifted toward patriarchal loyalty, announcing that my mother was being unreasonable. Even in Europe, among the diaspora who had emigrated seeking new norms, loyalties from home traveled like radio signals, crackling with assumptions. What helped us move forward, at least among those who cared to listen, was not rhetoric but the quiet, persistent reality of my mother's life. There was the truth that she had loved us fiercely. There was the truth that she had never been cruel. There was also the truth that she had never been given her own narrative in full. Instead, the story of her life had been told as an adjunct to my father's life. She had been named by her relationships, as wife, as mother, as sister-in-law, and those names had limits. I remember sitting with her one night in the small kitchen I used to know from childhood, the same radio playing an old ballad, her fingers nodding and unknotting a string. "Mark," she said, "do you know what it felt like? To be invisible even when everyone looked at me." The bluntness of that confession made me ache. I had, in my own life, let her invisibility be part of my comfort. I loved the parts of her that were quiet. I liked that some things were handed to me without needing to be negotiated. When she reached for more, for a life that included a loving companion, the request felt extravagant only because I had never imagined it for her. Thomas was not a savior in any cinematic sense. He was an ordinary man. Small kindnesses, steady laughter, a record of lonely afternoons. He had life experience. He also had the misapprehensions that come with visiting a country where many women look different. He asked, earnestly, about her children and about what marriage meant to her. He listened to her stories about Lagos, the music, the noise, the way the ocean felt, and he was not offended by them. He was willing, for reasons that were his own, to cross a cultural unfamiliarity. That willingness opened a door for my mother. What the media rarely shows in brief news cycles are the practicalities, the awkward phone calls, the forms, the quiet negotiations of dignity. When an older woman from Nigeria decides to marry a foreign man, the gears that turn are not just romance. There are visas to apply for, cultural adjustments to make, families to inform, sometimes to placate, sometimes to ignore. There's a negotiation of money, who pays for what, how to manage savings and pensions, the dissonance between expected gift traditions and European paperwork. My father insisted that she was being sold a mirage. A nice house, he told me, could be a gilded cage. He invoked stories of exploitation and told me not to trust those people. His anxiety had elements of racism, of course, but there was also the rawness of a man who had given pieces of himself to his own life and feared that another life would claim those pieces. Between the arguments and the forms, there was a great deal of human tenderness. My mother would call me at odd times and describe the small domestic details. The first time Thomas made her tea without overboiling it, the tiny way her laughter seemed to have returned. I would watch his name on my phone and feel my own initial resistance soften. He was not a hero. He was a human companion. There was something reasonable about that. At the same time, the friction in our family did not simply melt away. My father turned stubborn, as if by principle. He began to make the kind of speeches that had governed him for decades about respect, shame, and the family name. "Bring her back," he would say into the phone with the same clipped authority he used to command workmen. He would say it louder when relatives from the village called, when the aunties added hot coals of gossip. I learned something important through those months, that love is not always an antidote to fear. Fear can be stronger than tenderness, and fear knows how to masquerade convincingly as moral duty. My father's fear was wrapped in a vocabulary of tradition and honor. My mother's courage was wrapped in a vocabulary of survival and self-knowledge. Paperwork was signed where before it had been left blank. My mother and Thomas married quietly in a small civic ceremony that had nothing theatrically grand about it. 2 witnesses, a registrar, a ring. The day of their wedding, my mother phoned me and said, with a laugh that sounded young and old at the same time, "You should have seen his face when we signed those papers." There were many who condemned the union. Some called it betrayal. Some accused my mother of chasing wealth. Others simply could not imagine their mother in that role, older, chosen, beloved. But the truth is more pedestrian and, I would argue, more humane. My mother had found a companion and had the courage to say yes. What followed were, predictably, practical questions. How would they manage life between continents? Would Thomas move to Nigeria? Would my mother leave everything she had known? Those were not rhetorical. They were real and required ordinary decisions. My mother made them with the same practical intelligence she had always had. She spoke with Thomas about where to live. They planned for visits that would allow her to see her children and grandchildren. They made promises about pensions and visits, and, most crucially, about respect. There is a sociological note here that deserves mention. In many places, older women's romantic choices are less visible because society deems them unimportant, and yet when they do make those choices, when they say yes to companionship in their later years, the social ripples can be large. Families confront their assumptions. Certain patriarchy-based hierarchies are tested. Communities debate values. But these ripples often fade into the everyday. What remains are 2 people who choose to spend time together, a handful of shared meals, and the human dignity of 2 lives acknowledged. As for my father, time softened his rigidity. He did not, by any means, become an apostle of female autonomy. His speeches continued, but our relationship, too, changed. Perhaps what the whole affair did was reveal the limited nature of his authority. When my mother, quiet and steady, claimed an independent life, he had to reckon with a loss he had never anticipated, the loss of an unquestioned center. There are practical lessons in what followed. One is about communication. Families must make space for honest conversation about aging, about companionship, about loneliness. Another is about assumptions. Never assume that someone's contentment on the surface reflects their inner life. A third is perhaps the hardest to learn. Love and duty are not always the same thing. Loving someone does not mean keeping them confined to the role you prefer to see them in. If this story has an educational spine, it is this: dignity matters. It matters in marriages that are formally recognized and in those that are made of custom and history. It matters in how we let our elders decide for themselves. It matters in society's willingness to accept that autonomy has no age limit. There were practical, legal things too. Thomas, as a European citizen, eventually initiated the steps to make my mother's residency easier. It involved paperwork, a medical exam, a lot of waiting rooms with forms and languages that were not always patient. Through these gestures, my mother became more than a headline in our family. She became a migrant in the way many elders have become migrants. In that state, she gained rights, yes, but also vulnerabilities. Change, in any direction, brings both. I would be dishonest if I left out the moments of doubt. There were nights when I lay awake imagining scams and financial missteps. There were moments when I felt the old, corrosive jealousy. How could my mother have started a chapter that I had never imagined for her? It took time to recognize these feelings as my own inadequate frame of reference and to replace them with something more generous. When my son, my mother's grandson, grew older, he asked simple questions. "Grandma, why did you marry him?" he would say, eating jollof rice with an appetite that made me proud. My mother would laugh and say, "Because he makes my tea correctly." The simplicity of her answers taught me something vital. The reasons adults choose one another are often modest and human. Years later, when I look back, I see the arc of a woman who refused to remain merely the sum of expectations. My mother had been patient for her so long that when she finally called her own shot, the movement felt dramatic. In reality, it was simple courage. She wanted someone to share the small things with. She wanted to be an actor in her own life. If there is a moral in this long confession, it is not a tidy one. Families are messy. Love is messy. Traditions have their wisdom and their cruelty. But the space for autonomy, for the right to choose, must be defended not only for the young but for the older among us. Too often we reserve agency, like a privilege for those in their first bloom. My mother's story insists otherwise. To anyone reading who wonders how to respond when an elder in their life chooses an unexpected path, here are the principles I try to live by now. Begin with curiosity, not judgment. Ask questions that seek to understand rather than condemn. Remember that dignity is not age-bound. Allow elders to make choices, even if they surprise or inconvenience you. Protect practical interests, but separate them from moralizing. It is possible to ensure someone's financial and legal safety without dictating their romantic life. Listen to the stories people tell about themselves. Many lives are edited by silence. Giving space for narrative can be liberation. Recognize that patriarchy and tradition are complex. Respect cultural practices, but also interrogate whether those practices limit the flourishing of those you love. My father never ceased to be my father. He taught me to fix engines and stand up for what I believed. He also taught me, accidentally, that power must be tempered by compassion. My mother taught me the real lesson, that it is never too late to ask for what you need. People have asked me, often with a kind of incredulity, whether my mother regretted uprooting herself. She answers, always, with the same quiet, I regret the years I allowed myself not to have. That is both a lament and a manifesto. It implies nothing about blame except the quiet accusation we sometimes bring against ourselves for all the time we leave unclaimed. The last time I visited them both, Thomas and my mother, we ate together in a small sunlit kitchen that smelled of cardamom and fried plantain. My son, now taller than I had been at his age, chased a gossiping neighbor's dog while the adults talked about the price of tomatoes. Conversation drifted as it always does, from the practical to the trivial, and in the middle of it all, there was profound ordinariness to their love. Thomas handed my mother a cup of tea, my mother asking him to take off his shoes. The right to choose a life is the most human right there is. We are all, at various times, both the caretakers and the cared for. To honor another's choice is to honor their humanity, and to be loved in one's later years is a mercy as deep and rare as any given in youth. My mother's engagement, then marriage, was not a scandal. It was a reclamation. It was an insistence on being seen. And in the small, powerful quiet of that insistence, our family had to rearrange itself. That rearrangement was messy. It was also necessary. The story ends, if stories can ever truly end, with my mother looking out at the ocean from Thomas's small balcony, the wind turning her scarf into a small, stubborn flag. She had come a long distance to get there. Through years of unremarked labor, through the absence of legal papers, through the compromises of multiple households. She had arrived, finally, at a place of being chosen. If you ask me what I learned, I will tell you plainly. Love does not always look the way we expect it to, and dignity is the most practical thing to offer another person. Give it freely, and watch how people build from there.